Welcome back to Backspace Academy. Before we start the lab, make sure that you've got your introduction to AWS lab notes on hand. And the section that we're going to be working on is creating a SQL database with RDS. So starting off in the management console, the first thing that we need to do before we create our RDS instance is that we need to make sure that we create a security group that will allow remote connection into that RDS instance, because by default, it will be private and that will not be allowed. So we're going to create a security group, and we're going to have a rule in that security group that is going to allow access from the wider internet. And someone who accesses it will need to have the username and password for that database to access. So what we'll do now is we'll search for the VPC service. And there it is. And we need to go into security groups. So we'll scroll down and go to security groups. And we're going to create a security group. We need to give the security group a name and a description. That will be fine for a description. We need to make sure that we're selecting our default VPC. So I'm just going to close this, make sure that we're selecting our default VPC here. There we go. Now we need to create some inbound rules that are going to allow inbound traffic to this database. Let's add a rule. And the traffic type is going to be for MySQL. So scroll down and here we can see MySQL and also Amazon Aurora. We'll be receiving traffic on port 3306 and the source will be anywhere IPv4. And we're going to add another one. And again, it will be MySQL Aurora. And we're going to do this for IPv6. Now, if we wanted to really secure this down, we could actually, instead of having anywhere, we could actually use my IP, and that would lock it to your IP address. You can do that, that's fine, and that will make it a little bit more secure, so only you can access it using your IP address. I'm not going to do that because I have multiple internet connections coming in through a load balancer here, and so my IP address changes quite a bit, so I have to use this anywhere. But you can use that my IP if you want to lock it down specifically to your IP address. Now the outbound rules, we don't have to define an outbound rule because security groups are stateful. And what that means is that any inbound requests that come in to this database, the outbound responses will be automatically allowed. We could add a tag to this if we wanted. We're not going to bother with adding a tag to that. And we just click on Create a Security Group. So there we can see it's created our security group. It's got those two inbound rules, which are going to allow MySQL access on IPv4 and IPv6 on port range 3306. Okay. So now what we need to do is to create this RDS instance and then associate this security group with that RDS instance. So we'll go and search here for RDS. And I'm just going to open that up in another tab. So let's go ahead and create the database. Now it's going to be a standard create that we're doing. It's going to be a MySQL. Scroll down and it's going to be Community Edition of MySQL. That's fine. And we're going to use the free tier. We don't want to pay for this, so we're going to use that. We'll give this database a name and we're just going to call it, well, I'm going to call it Backspace Intro AWS. And our credentials, we'll leave that as admin. We'll just put in a password and we'll confirm that password. So the instant class is going to be a T2 micro, and that is because that is covered under the free tier. So you can see that, that's the only option that is available for us because that's the only one on the free tier. We'll leave that storage as it is. We're not going to worry about storage auto scaling. And we don't do multi-availability deployment. So if this was not on the free tier, we could set up multi-AZ deployment where we'd have multiple instances in multiple availability zones. So if one of the availability zones goes down, the other availability zone will kick in. And so again, connectivity, we're going to be using our default VPC, and we're going to allow public access. So we click on yes for that. And we're just going to keep that with the default subnet group. We'll scroll down and we need to select our existing VPC security group. There it is, backspace RDS intro lab. There we go. And we can see there it's put that in there ready to go. We're not going to have any preference for an availability zone. We'll go down to authentication. We're going to stay with password authentication. And we're just going to expand additional configuration here. So we're going to have an initial database. So we'll give it an initial database name and we'll just call this test. And we're not going to worry about automated backups. This is only a lab. We're not going to be doing anything spectacular with it. We're just going to create a database and then tear it down afterwards. So we don't need to have automated backups. We don't need enhanced monitoring or anything like that. Okay, so no preference for maintenance window. We'll leave deletion protection unchecked. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, so estimated monthly cost. The Amazon RDS free tier is available for you up to 12 months. And there we go. So we're underneath that, so we're not going to be getting a bill. So let's create that database. So after a certain amount of time, it does take quite a bit of time to launch and set up this database, but it will eventually happen. Okay, so after quite a bit of time, quite a few minutes, we've got this database has been created. Now, if we click on this refresh button here, we'll be able to see that its status is now available. Okay, so let's just click on that now. I'll just close this green pop-up. Okay, so what we've got here is an endpoint and port. So that is the URL that we're going to use to connect into this instance remotely. And of course, we're going to do it on port 3306 as we defined in that security group rule. So in order to connect remotely, we need to have the MySQL workbench installed on our remote computer, and we can install that on Windows, Linux or Mac, not a problem. The instructions there, or the link to connecting to it, is in the lab notes. So I'm just going to click on that now. And that will give you the instructions on how to install the MySQL workbench. And so there will be an installer there. So we go to the Windows installer there. Or if we're looking for a different one, we can look at Ubuntu here, or sorry, Linux here. So we can click on Workbench for Linux or Workbench on Mac OS. So just follow those instructions, and depending on what client you're using, Windows, Linux or Mac, just install the right software on there. So once you've done that, you can open up the MySQL Workbench, and I'll just get that into the screen here. There we go. Okay. So I've already got a connection here, which I'm just going to delete. So what we need to do now is to create a connection to our RDS instance. The way we do that is we click here on the plus sign. And what we need is a connection name, and it can be anything that we want. I'm just going to call it RDS. The connection method is going to be standard TCP IP. Now the host name, we need to get that, and it's going to be on port 3306. So we're going to jump back into the RDS console, and we're going to get that endpoint, and we're going to copy that. And we're going to put that in here. And the username is not root, it's going to be admin, because that was what we used for our username when we created the RDS instance. We used admin, and you need to remember what that password was. And let's go and test this connection. Okay, it's asking for a password. We'll put that password in and see what happens. Okay, so we successfully made the MySQL connection. Now, if that didn't work for you, just go into the lab notes. There is a section there on troubleshooting your connection issues. Most probably you haven't selected the database when you've created as public access, or you haven't done the security group properly and associated that to the instance, or you used the wrong username and password. So the username we created was admin, and the password was whatever you created when you launched that instance. So that is fine. So I'm going to click on OK. Now, to have a look inside that, I can just double click on this, and it's going to open the SQL editor. Okay, and there we have our MySQL workbench with its editor, and we can do all of our SQL statements and that sort of thing that you would do. We can see here we've also got this test database, which was created for us by AWS. Okay, that brings us to the end of the lab. We've created an RDS instance and we've connected into it remotely using the MySQL workbench. Everything seems to work fine. Again, if you have any troubles, just go back to the lab notes, look at the troubleshooting section, and it's pretty straightforward. You should be able to work that out. So I'm just going to close out of the workbench, and I'm going to go into the RDS Management Console, click on our databases here, select our Backspace Intro AWS database. I'm going to go to Actions, and I'm going to delete this database. We delete. Now we don't need to create a final snapshot because there's nothing on this database, so we'll just get rid of it. And we acknowledge that it's not going to be available after this, that's fine. And then we also need to type in here, delete me. Okay, and we'll delete that. Okay, so after quite some time, we have now successfully deleted that instance. Now, because we've deleted it, we can now delete the security group. We can't delete the security group until this instance has been deleted. So let's jump into the VPC Management Console again. And here's our security group. We're just going to go into Actions, delete security group. And yes, we're going to delete that. And it was successfully deleted. So that brings us to the end of this lab. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.